3 men attacked the mafia boss. They laughed at the waitress until she turned around. The air in Bayhaven tasted like salt and rust. It was a wet night in Harbor's Edge, the kind where the Atlantic fog muscled its way inland, blurring the neon signs of the dive bars and bait shops into watercolor smears on the wet pavement. The Gull and Anchor was the only bright spot on the Strip, a low-slung seafood joint packed tight against the cold. Steam fogged the windows, carrying the sharp smell of fried oysters, old wood, and cheap beer inside. The noise was a constant roar, plates clattering, fishermen shouting over the jukebox, the frantic, spitting hiss of the kitchen grill. In the back booth, the one furthest from the drafty door, Nico Avalon watched the room. At 35, he wore a slate-gray suit that seemed crafted from the city's own shadows, a stark contrast to the fishermen's oilskins, yet he blended perfectly, a quiet center of gravity in the chaos. Nico owned this dock, this water, this edge of the city, all of it neatly hidden behind a complex stack of legitimate shipping logistics companies. Across from him, his advisor, Maura Vale, nursed a club soda, her eyes as sharp and watchful as his. They were finishing a late dinner, the hum of their low conversation deliberately lost in the restaurant's din. June Hart moved her through the tables like water flowing around rocks. 27, quiet, almost invisible in her plain black uniform. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, practical knot. A simple digital stopwatch hung on a thin lanyard around her neck, tucked safely into her apron pocket. She was just another waitress, harmless, rushing orders, her gaze flicking between the kitchen window and the demanding tables. Then the door swung open hard, letting in a cold, wet slice of fog that silenced the tables nearest it. 3 men entered. They were too large for the narrow space, their coats too bulky, smelling of wet wool and something metallic, like old pennies. They didn't look at the menu board. They scanned the crowd, their eyes heavy, landing immediately on the back booth. They laughed, a rough, barking sound that cut through the restaurant's warmth. One of them, the clear leader with a puckered scar on his chin, nudged his companion. He pointed his chin at June, who was refilling a water glass nearby, her back partially to them. Nico looked up. He had been reaching into his jacket for his wallet, ready to sign the check. Maura's hand, resting on the table, tensed. The men moved toward the booth, swaggering, deliberately brushing past June. The leader knocked her shoulder, hard. "Hey!" he barked, his voice unnecessarily loud. June turned, startled, and he saw the small, flesh-toned device tucked into her right ear. He laughed, tapping his own ear mockingly. "Deaf girl. Can't hear, then get out of the way." They laughed again, a cruel, dismissive sound. They had forgotten her instantly. They were focused on Nico, who was now slowly placing his pen on the table. One of the men, the one on the right, casually flipped the side of his coat back, revealing the black polymer butt of a handgun tucked into his waistband. June turned. She wasn't carrying water. She was holding a heavy, oval stainless steel tray. On it sat a cast-iron, sizzling skillet special, the small grill plate still popping and spitting droplets of hot oil from the steak and onions. The men saw the tray only as another obstacle. The leader sneered. June didn't hesitate. It wasn't a panic move. It was a calculation. She shifted her weight from her back foot to her front. With a fractional tilt of her left hand, she sent a silvery arc of scalding, garlic-infused oil sailing from the edge of the skillet. It wasn't a big splash. It was a precise pour. It landed directly on the polished leather shoe and exposed ankle of the man nearest her. He screamed. It was a high, sharp sound that pierced the restaurant's noise. He reflexively staggered back, grabbing at his burning foot. The gun he was just beginning to draw slipped from his right hand. He fumbled, catching it awkwardly in his left, his primary hand now useless, his balance broken. Nico hadn't even pushed his chair back yet. The second man lunged, shoving a customer aside, his own hand diving into his coat. June met his momentum. She wasn't holding the tray anymore, she had dropped it. Her right hand gripped the handle of the heavy, black cast-iron skillet itself. She didn't swing it like a club. She moved with the brutal precision of a butcher, a short, contained jab that connected with the exact spot on his inner wrist, the nerve cluster just above the bone. There was a wet crack. The man's eyes went wide with white-hot, electric pain. His fingers splayed open instantly. His gun clattered uselessly to the greasy floorboards. The third man, the leader with the scar, ignored her. He had his target. He raised his own weapon, a heavy revolver, aiming it straight at Nico Avalon's chest. Nico. The roar came from the back hallway, near the kitchens. Rhodes Pike, Nico's bodyguard, was framed in the doorway, fighting a jammed security latch. He was too far away. The dining room exploded, tables overturned, glass shattered, people screamed and scrambled for the exits, a tide of bodies blocking roads. The gunman steadied his aim. June was already moving. She was too far to reach him, the overturned tables blocking her path. She used the only thing she had left. Her apron strings, thick white cotton, were dangling. She grabbed one end. In a single fluid motion, like casting a fishing line, she whipped the weighted, knotted end of the string forward. The knot snapped hard against the gunman's trigger finger just as he squeezed. The explosion was deafening in the small space. The shot went wild, deflected upward. The bullet punched through the glowing plastic of the Today's Catch menu board, showering the bar in dead sparks and melted plastic. A new silence fell, thick and heavy, broken only by the whimpering of a customer hiding under a table. The gunman stared at his stinging hand, then at June, his face a mask of pure disbelief. June Hart stood panting, her chest heaving, the skillet still gripped in her right hand, but her eyes were glacial. She looked past the gunman, directly at Nico, who was still half standing by his booth. "Sit down," she commanded, her voice low and perfectly steady. The spell broke. The sound of distant, approaching sirens cut through the fog. The gunman, realizing the operation was blown, bolted for the door, shoving his two injured, groaning companions ahead of him. Outside, the headlights of a white sedan, no plates, slashed across the wet street and vanished into the night. The leader, the real threat, had never even stepped inside. Rhodes finally burst into the room, gun drawn, scanning the wreckage. Mara was already on her feet, her hand on Nico's arm, checking him. But Nico Avalon hadn't moved. He was staring at June Hart. She wasn't just the quiet waitress. She wasn't the deaf girl. He watched her turn, her eyes scanning the lips of the frantic, crying customers, calming them, directing them toward the kitchen exit. He realized it then. She hadn't heard the insult clearly. She hadn't heard the click of the gun safety from across the room. She had seen it. She'd been reading their lips the moment they walked through the door. The Gull and Anchor was silent for the first time all night. The silence was wrong, heavier and colder than the fog outside. Overturned chairs cast long, broken shadows under the harsh fluorescent lights of the kitchen, which stayed on while the dining room lights were killed. The air, stripped of the sounds of laughter and sizzling food, smelled only of spilled beer, fear sweat, and the metallic tang of the single gunshot. June Hart sat on a stainless steel prep counter, her legs dangling. She stared at the floor, watching a puddle of melted ice and shrimp scampi butter slowly congeal. Mara Vale knelt before her, her movements precise as she taped a square of gauze to June's forearm, covering a shallow graze from a flying piece of the menu board. "You're lucky this was just plastic," Mara said, her voice low and calm, devoid of panic. Outside the front windows, Rhodes Pike stood in the drizzle, his broad back to them. He was using a penlight to examine the splintered hole in the restaurant's wooden sign, his head tilted as if listening to the wound. No one had died. The stampede of panicked customers had resulted in nothing worse than a sprained ankle and a lost wallet. But the invisible line between a normal Tuesday night and chaos had been crossed. Nico Avalon stood by the bar, shrugging his slate gray suit jacket back onto his shoulders. He hadn't taken his eyes off June. He moved across the wrecked dining room, his expensive shoes crunching softly on broken glass. He stopped a few feet away, not crowding her. "Where did you learn those tricks?" he asked. His voice wasn't an accusation. It was a quiet, necessary question. June finished tying her own apron, which she'd untangled from a chair leg. She didn't look at him. "You pick things up." She flexed her bandaged arm. "The chef at my last job was a nightmare. You learn to handle hot cast iron without flinching." "And the man with the gun," Nico pressed, his voice soft. "The one you disarmed." June's gaze flickered to the heavy skillet she had used, now sitting on the drain board, looking innocent. "My father was a locksmith," she said, her voice flat. "He taught me that most things are just mechanisms, hinges, levers, bones. You just have to know where the weak point is." Nico studied her profile. It was a perfect, plausible, and utterly incomplete answer. The wail of sirens finally grew loud, arriving a solid 15 minutes too late for a shooting in Harbor's Edge. Red and blue lights washed the restaurant's interior, pulsing silently through the fogged-up windows, painting the room in unnatural shades of blood and ice. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, followed by a man in a rumpled trench coat. He flashed a wallet badge so quickly it was just a glint of gold. Metropolitan Crime Directorate, MCD. He was the one in charge. He took in the scene, the overturned tables, the bullet hole. Nico Avalon standing calmly by the bar, and his expression didn't change. While the uniformed cops took lazy statements from the shaking restaurant owner, the MCD detective ambled over to Nico. He spoke just loud enough for June and Mara to hear. "Mr. Avalon, a brawl. Looks like some fishermen get too rowdy." Nico looked at the bullet hole. "Something like that." "Good." The detective nodded, not writing anything down. "Best not to make a big deal of it. Bad for tourism, this kind of excitement." He gave a thin, professional smile and turned to leave. As the detective pushed the glass door open, June saw it. It was small, scrawled on the fogged glass of the door jamb in what looked like grease pencil. A symbol, 2 intersecting semicircles, like a pair of spectacles set on their side, a child's drawing of an owl's eyes. Her blood went cold. She knew that mark, pure glass circle. The detective walked right past it, his eyes seeing nothing. He had been sent to see nothing. Nico saw the shift in her expression. He followed her gaze to the door, noted the graffiti, and then looked back at her. His eyes narrowed, and a silent, dark understanding passed between them. This wasn't a random attack. This wasn't a botched robbery. This was a message, clumsily delivered. Someone wanted the gunshot to be officially recorded as a simple brawl. They were sweeping the stage clean, making room for something else. Something that required the authorities to be looking the other way. Something at Pier 6. The police left. The owner, grateful to still have a restaurant, promised to clean up. June slid off the counter, untying her dirty apron. Her shift was over. Her life here, she suspected, was also over. She grabbed her thin jacket from a hook. "I'll let myself out the back," she said to no one in particular. She made it 2 steps before Rhodes Pike moved from the front door, blocking her path to the kitchen. He wasn't threatening. He was as solid and unmovable as the harbor wall. "I was stuck," Rhodes said, his voice a low rumble. "That latch was jammed. I saw it all. You turned your back to save my boss." He pulled a set of keys from his pocket. "We're taking you home." The ride was silent at first. Nico's car wasn't a flashy limousine, but a heavy, black European sedan that smelled of clean leather and the faint, cold scent of the ocean. Mara drove. Rhodes sat in the passenger seat. Nico sat in the back with June, leaving a respectful, professional distance between them. The car moved through the slick, empty streets of Harbor's Edge, the windshield wipers keeping a steady, hypnotic rhythm. "You're not a waitress," Nico said finally. It wasn't a question. June watched the blurred neon lights slide across her reflection in the window. "I am tonight. I was yesterday." "The pier glass circle," he said. You recognize the mark." June's throat felt tight. She had been pulled in the second she tilted that skillet. "I used to work for a civic agency," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Budget oversight. I saw things I shouldn't have. In procurement files, contracts, that symbol was on a redacted addendum." She paused, remembering the sterile office, the quiet threats, the sudden, inexplicable restructuring of her department. "I filed an internal report. 2 days later, my security clearance was gone. My personnel file vanished from the system. It was like I never existed. So, I made it official. I changed my name. I found a job where people don't look at you twice." Nico didn't ask which agency. He didn't ask what she saw. He just nodded, accepting the pieces she offered. The car stopped at a red light. The silence stretched, filled only by the rhythmic tick of the wiper blades. "They laughed at you," Nico said, his voice soft but edged with steel. He was looking at her reflection, not at her. "They laughed because they thought you were weak, because of the hearing aid, because you were small. They built their whole plan on the idea that you were invisible, harmless." He turned his head, his dark eyes finding hers in the dim light. "When you turned around, their whole world, their whole order, it just broke." June looked at her own reflection in the glass. The city lights cut across her face, splitting her in two. One half was bathed in the warm, fleeting glow of a passing street lamp. The other was lost in the absolute, deep shadow black of the night. She saw the waitress, tired and scared, and she saw the other person, the one who knew the weak points in bones and the dark grammar of secret symbols. She realized, with a sinking, cold certainty, that she had just stepped directly back into the exact world she had nearly died trying to escape. Outside, far beyond the sleeping city, the deep, mournful sound of a foghorn blasted across the water. The sea was murmuring. It was a long, slow warning. The 9 o'clock morning news cycle hit Bayhaven like a jolt of caffeine. The front page of the Chronicle's website and every local broadcast was dominated by the North Water Redevelopment Trust. They were selling a vision of glittering high-rises and pristine public parks. The media called it a golden opportunity. The largest revitalization project in the city's history. The harbor, they declared, was about to be reborn. In a soundproofed office tucked behind the organized chaos of a wholesale fish market, Nico Avalon watched the fantasy unfold on a muted screen. Mara Vale stood beside him, holding a tablet displaying the actual city planning blueprints, not the glossy press renders. Nico had brought June here before sunrise. Now, he tapped the large, wall-mounted schematic. The optimistic blue tint of the North Water project completely covered 2 densely populated districts. "Verdigris Market," he said, tracing the tight grid of streets with his finger, "and Garnet Row." June stared at the map. She knew those places. They were not dilapidated ruins. They were the city's engine. Streets filled with tenement apartments, bakers' shops, and laundromats, all packed with the families of dock workers and fishermen. "They're not revitalizing," June said, her voice quiet. "They're erasing. They'll push thousands of people out, bulldoze the history, and wash their money-clean building condos no one here can afford." Nico looked at her. "You recognized that mark last night, the pier glass circle." June's hand instinctively went to her temple, as if to ward off a headache. The memory was gray, sterile. "CSB," she said, "the Civic Shadow Bureau. I saw it in my old job." "The City Planning Commission," Matwara interjected, looking up from her own research. "They're just a quasi-public agency. They coordinate urban interests and handle zoning permits." "That's the public-facing description," June countered. "But I processed their budgets. They had massive discretionary funds, black box accounts, and a network of redacted subcontractors. That circle. It was their internal stamp for managed urban relocation. It meant the project was approved to proceed by any means necessary, and the paperwork would be buried before it ever started. On the muted television, the Northwater press conference replayed. A slick spokesman talked about community first, but June's eyes locked onto a man standing behind him, whispering to a city councilwoman. He was slightly off camera, his words lost to the microphone, but his lips were moving clearly. June went utterly still. She focused, her world narrowing to the man's mouth, the shapes he was forming. It was a skill she had perfected not just from her hearing loss, but from years of surviving in rooms where she wasn't supposed to be listening. Just need to get to the warehouse burning stage. Then we can really squeeze the price. A chill ran down her spine. They're going to set fires, she said. Nico and Mara turned to her. What? The advisor, June pointed at the screen. He just told the councilwoman, we just need to get to the warehouse burning stage. Then we can really squeeze the price. Last night wasn't just a message, it was the start. They're manufacturing a public safety crisis to make the land worthless. Then Northwater sweeps in as the only savior who can fix it. Nico's jaw tightened. He nodded, a dark suspicion hardening into fact. Silas Quinn. The name hung in the air. Who is Silas Quinn? June asked. The future, Mara said, her voice dripping with cynicism. He's a tech billionaire, Bayhaven's golden boy. He gives speeches about green energy and smart cities. He's a philanthropist whose name is on hospitals and libraries. And Northwater is his pet project, Nico added, his voice low and hard. He smiles at galas, shakes hands at City Hall, and has an unnaturally close, completely deniable relationship with the CSB. The office door opened, and Rhodes Pike entered. He held a small, damp piece of paper. The white sedan from last night, he rumbled. Plates were faked, but I got a partial VIN from a traffic cam 2 blocks away. Ran it through a back channel. He placed the paper on Nico's desk, registered to a private security firm, Iron Bar Shielding. Mara's fingers flew across her tablet. Her face went taut. Iron Bar Shielding, she read, her voice tight, is the exclusive security and logistics subcontractor for the Civic Shadow Bureau, a 5-year, city-funded contract. A closed loop, Nico said. Quinn uses the CSB to authorize his land grab. The CSB uses Iron Bar to do the dirty work, and Iron Bar sends gunmen to my table to make the neighborhood look like a war zone. Mara shut the tablet. Nico, this is a different league. We're not pushing back against a rival organization. We are touching a public-private alliance. These people don't wear colors. They wear bespoke suits. They don't just break laws. They write them. We can't fight City Hall and a billionaire. A heavy silence filled the room. Nico looked at June. He was not giving an order. He was not asking for a favor. He was waiting. June broke the silence. Her mind was working, clicking through variables. Those men last night were sloppy, she said, thinking aloud. They were overconfident. They were sent to make noise, not to win. She pulled the digital stopwatch from her pocket. It was still hanging from its lanyard, which she hadn't taken off. I need to go back to the Gull and Anchor, tonight, after they close. For what? Rhodes asked. His arms crossed. A reconstruction. June held up the stopwatch. I can time my own movements. I know the milliseconds between the oil hitting his foot and the second man lunging. I know the exact angle of the deflected shot from the trigger slap. She looked at Rhodes, her eyes sharp. But mostly, I know the trajectory of the grease spill. That sizzling skillet oil. It's not water. It doesn't just evaporate. On that wet, dirty pavement, it leaves a specific, tacky smear. They stepped in it. I can trace their path back to where they parked. The restaurant, dark and smelling of bleach, was a crime scene of their own making. It took them 3 hours. June moved like a ghost, stopwatch in hand, measuring angles with string, while Rhodes and Nico watched in silence. She found the first greasy footprint under a streetlight, 50 yards from the door, then another. The trail led away from the main road, down a service alley, back toward the black, churning water. It ended at a 12-foot-high chain-link fence, topped with razor wire. Beyond it sat Pier 6. It was a single, monstrous, windowless building, a cold storage warehouse. The official sign on the gate, illuminated by a single harsh floodlight, read Property of the North Water Redevelopment Trust. Storm relief supplies do not enter. Storm relief, Nico said, his voice a low growl. Courtesy of the city, no doubt. June stared at the massive, dark building. That's not storm relief. That's the warehouse burning stage. They're storing the accelerant in there. Nico turned to face her. The salt spray was cold on her face. He saw the fatigue in her posture, but also the iron in her spine. They won't stop, he said. Now that they know you're with me, you're a loose end. This isn't just about a contract anymore. This is an eradication. He didn't move closer, but his presence was a shield against the wind. Are you in this with me, June? She looked away from him, at the dark, humming warehouse. She thought of the families in Verdigris Market, sleeping in their beds, while men in suits plotted to burn them out. She thought of the cold, arrogant smile of the advisor on the TV. She turned back, her gaze meeting his without flinching. I'm not in this for you, Nico. I'm in this for them. June zipped her thin jacket up to her chin, her eyes fixed on the gate. I'm not here to help you build another throne. A rare, slow smile touched the corner of Nico Avalon's mouth. It was a cold, dangerous expression. Good, he said. Thrones are too easy to tip over. Let's go look at those storm supplies. Pier 6 at 2 a.m. was a dead zone. The only sound was the high, thin whine of the industrial refrigeration units, a noise that felt colder than the wind sweeping off the Atlantic. The air was sharp, stinging the back of the throat with the chemical bite of ammonia and the damp cellar smell of wet concrete. Ice crystals, thick as fur, coated the chain-link fence. June moved first, her team a tight shadow behind her roads, Nico, and a wiry man named Blake Wren, Nico's most trusted driver. All four wore generic dark blue work coveralls with a single reflective stripe, stolen from a Port Authority locker. They were meant to look like a late-night maintenance crew. The main gate was electronic, but the pedestrian access door was an analog beast, a heavy steel plate with a circular, vandal-proof lock. Rhodes stepped up, ready to apply a crowbar. Wait, June whispered. She pulled a standard metal paperclip from her jacket pocket, another item borrowed from the port office, in her gloved hands. She bent it, straightening one end, creating a tension wrench with the other. Nico watched, his breath pluming in the cold air. The lock was designed to resist brute force. June inserted the bent clip, applying delicate pressure. She followed it with the straightened end, her head tilted, listening, feeling the tumblers. It wasn't just a skill her father, the locksmith, had taught her. It was a language. She felt the subtle click, click, click of the pins aligning. It was as rhythmic and precise as breathing. In under 10 seconds, there was a solid, satisfying thunk. The lock was open. Nico looked at her, his expression masked by the shadows, but she could feel his astonishment. She just pushed the heavy, insulated door open, revealing a cavern of absolute, freezing darkness. Blake Wren clicked on a low-beam flashlight. The beam cut through the frozen fog inside. They weren't in a warehouse. They were in a tomb. It was not filled with pallets of bottled water, blankets, or MREs. The vast echoing space was stacked 20 feet high with black, 55-gallon drums and military-grade transport cases. A thick layer of frost covered everything. Blake aimed his light at the stenciling on one of the cases. It didn't say storm relief. It bore a simple 3-letter designation OUI. Office of Urban Integrity. June breathed, recognizing the name from the same dark budgets as the CSB. It was another ghost agency. Nico moved deeper, prying the lid off one of the drums with a tool from his belt, a sharp, chemical reek, different from the ammonia, wafted out. It's not accelerant, he said, his voice grim. Not just, this is cold burn thermite. Designed to cut through structural steel, Rhodes added, his voice a low rumble. And these, he tapped a crate filled with metallic discs. Delayed incendiary devices, you can set the timers for weeks. They weren't just planning to light fires. They were planning to gut the foundations of the city, block by block. June spotted a ruggedized tablet sitting on a charging station by the loading bay door, still logged in, the inventory manifest. She powered it on, her gloved fingers flying across the screen. They're not just storing it, they're shipping it out. She clicked on a dispatch log. Her blood ran colder than the air. It was a schedule. Verdigris Market, she read, her voice shaking slightly. Block 4, scheduled for accidental catastrophic failure in 72 hours. Garnet Row, 2 days after, a third residential block, the week after that. It was a timetable for the systematic destruction of the neighborhoods that stood in North Water's way. "We have it," Nico said. "This is everything. Blake, get that tablet." The moment Blake's fingers touched the device to disconnect it, it happened. It wasn't a loud alarm. It was the opposite. The high, thin whine of the refrigeration unit suddenly cut out, plunging the warehouse into a deafening, terrifying silence. Then, a single, harsh floodlight snapped on, pinning them in its white, unforgiving glare. "Trap," Rhodes growled, shoving Blake behind a stack of barrels. A red light on a ceiling-mounted security camera swiveled toward them. It hadn't been on before. Someone had cut the sound and activated the sensors from a remote hub. They had been watched. They had been allowed in. Heavy, booted footsteps echoed from the metal gantries above. "Iron bar," Rhodes hissed, drawing his weapon. "At least 4. You two, go find another way out. Go." Rhodes shoved Nico and June toward a dark service corridor as the first shot rang out, sparking off the concrete floor where they had just been standing. Rhodes returned fire. 2 precise shots that extinguished the floodlight, buying them darkness. June grabbed Nico's arm, pulling him. "This way, the ice chute." They plunged into a narrow technical passage, the sound of gunfire echoing behind them. They burst through a set of plastic strip curtains onto a different platform. Below them was a massive stainless steel conveyor belt, designed to move block ice onto container ships. It was dark and still. "It leads right down to the slip," she panted. "We can drop onto a container." Before they could move, another set of lights snapped on, illuminating the high catwalks that ran the length of the warehouse. A figure stood there, looking down at them. He was tall, dressed in an immaculate gray overcoat, his hands resting on the railing. He wasn't armed. He didn't need to be. Silas Quinn. He was smiling. "Nico Avalon," Quinn called out, his voice echoing pleasantly, as if greeting a guest at a party. "You really shouldn't be playing with things that don't belong to you. Bayhaven only has room for one person making the decisions." Nico shielded June behind him, his body tense, searching the shadows for other threats. June wasn't looking at the other threats. She was looking at Silas Quinn. He was still smiling, but he had turned his head slightly, speaking into a tiny invisible earpiece. His lips were moving, forming words she could read as clearly as if he had shouted them. "It's fine," his lips formed. "We have them. She's here." He paused, listening to the voice in his ear. Then he spoke again. A short, simple phrase. "Daughter, come home." June's heart froze. The words slammed into her chest, stealing her breath, rooting her to the metal floor. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the cadence, the specific, familiar way the O in home was formed. It was a muscle memory she had watched 1,000 times across a dinner table, in arguments, in bedtime stories. It was her mother, Vera Hart, the woman who had vanished, the woman who had supposedly been destroyed by the very system June was now fighting. Silas Quinn was just a puppet. The voice in his ear, the voice running this entire operation, was her mother. Nico saw the look on her face. He saw her eyes, wide and shattered, fixed on nothing. He didn't know why, but he knew what paralysis looked like. June move. He grabbed her, yanking her bodily off the platform and onto the steep, slippery incline of the ice conveyor belt. They half slid, half fell down the 30-foot chute, the polished steel icy cold even through their coveralls. They landed hard on the corrugated metal roof of a shipping container, the impact knocking the wind from her. The second they hit the container, a deafening, concussive blast blew the service door they had just exited off its hinges. The explosion was controlled, localized, a punctuation mark, a warning shot. It wasn't meant to kill them. It was meant to show them they had survived only by permission. Alarms blared across the entire port. Shouts and sirens erupted from every direction. The trap was sprung. Nico pulled her to her feet. "Rhodes Blake," he yelled into his radio. "We're out," Rhodes's voice crackled back, strained. "The west fence. Go now." Nico grabbed June's hand. She was numb, moving like an automaton. He pulled her across the container roofs, leaping the dark, narrow gaps between them, until they dropped onto the wet cobblestones of the pier and melted back into the shadows they had come from. They lost everything: the tablet, the sample of the thermite, any physical proof that the warehouse held anything but storm relief. As they piled into Blake's waiting car, which screamed away from the curb, Nico looked at June. She was staring at her own hands, shaking, but clutched in her right hand so tightly her knuckles were white was a single, black, pocket-sized hard drive. She had plugged it into the tablet for less than 5 seconds. It was just enough. She had the data, but she also had the truth, and it was 1,000 times heavier. The hard drive felt like a block of ice in June's hand. They were back in the fish market office. The smell of brine and diesel a stark contrast to the sterile, chemical cold of the warehouse. The sun was rising, casting a sick, gray light over the harbor. "Vera Hart," June said to the room. Her voice was flat, hollowed out. "She's my mother." Rhodes, cleaning his weapon in the corner, stopped. Mora, who'd been plugging the drive into a secure, air-gapped laptop, looked up, her expression unreadable. Nico just watched June, his gaze steady, patient. "She was the CSB's star coordinator," June continued, pacing the small room. "She believed in urban order. She believed the city was a machine that needed a firm hand to run." June's hands clenched. "Then there was a public hearing, a zoning dispute. Someone accused her of taking bribes to push a project through. It was ugly. Public. She was shamed. And then she vanished. Wiped from the system, just like they did to me. I thought she was destroyed by it. I thought she was hiding somewhere. Broken. I hated her for being corrupt, and I hated her for being a victim. I cut all ties. I changed my name. I just wanted to disappear." She finally looked at Nico. She wasn't hiding. She was climbing. "She's not climbing, June," Mara said, her voice sharp. "She's at the top." All eyes turned to the laptop screen. Mara had decrypted the first layer of the drive. It was a spider's web of financial charts. "The money," Mara said, her finger tracing a line on the screen. "It's all here. North Water, Iron Bar Shielding, the Office of Urban Integrity. They aren't just subcontractors for the CSB. They are the CSB." She pointed to a central node. "It all flows through a single bridge bank in the Cayman Islands, a shell corporation, and the sole beneficiary of that corporation's holding company." She clicked, and a new name appeared, the Silas Quinn Philanthropic Fund. "He's washing the city's own money," Nico said, his voice a low growl. "He uses his charity to launder it, then funds the OUI to acquire the thermite and Iron Bar to plant it, all under the legal protection of the CSB, which Vera controls." "It's a perfect closed loop," June whispered, horrified. "They're using public funds to destroy public neighborhoods, so a private developer can buy the land for nothing." As if summoned, Mara's phone buzzed with an encrypted alert. She read it, and her face went pale. "It's my source at City Hall, the warehouse explosion. It's already working. The media is screaming about uncontrolled gang warfare on the piers. The city council has moved up the vote. They're convening an emergency session to approve the sale of Harbor's Edge." "When?" Nico demanded. 3 days. "They're not just creating a crisis," June said, her mind racing. "They're pinning it on you, the dangerous element. You're the reason the city needs saving by Silas Quinn." Nico stood silent for a full minute, looking at the schematic of Verdigris Market on his wall. Rhodes shifted, tensing, ready for an order to strike back. "We can't fight them in the shadows," Nico said finally. "Vera owns the shadows. We fight them in the light." He turned to Rhodes. "Take every dollar we have in liquid, every cent, go to Verdigris Market. I want a community kitchen open by sundown. Free meals, 24 hours a day." Rhodes blinked, confused. "Boss a soup kitchen?" "They want to burn people out," Nico said, his eyes hard. "We are going to anchor them. We will become the center of that community. We will give them a reason to stay, a reason to fight. It's a nail. Rhodes. A spike driven right into their timeline. They can't bulldoze a neighborhood that's feeding itself, not while the cameras are rolling." June nodded, seeing the strategy. "And I'll handle the cameras." She pulled out her own burner phone, scrolling to a number she hadn't touched in 3 years. "I still know people. Independent journalists, the kind who hate Silas Quinn's manufactured golden boy image. They're small, but they're fast." She pressed the call button. "I need a window," she said into the phone, her voice all business. "A guaranteed, uninterrupted live stream. If I get you hard proof of civic corruption, will you broadcast it?" She listened. "Good. Wait for my signal." Later that night, the adrenaline had faded, leaving June exhausted, slumped at a desk in the office, staring at the financial charts. Rhodes set a steaming styrofoam cup of black coffee in front of her. He didn't leave. "You know," he rumbled, his deep voice startling her, "since you showed up, I've seen him more." June looked up, confused. "What are you talking about? He's right there." Nico was across the room, on the phone, his voice low and commanding. "No," Rhodes said, not looking at his boss. "I mean, I've seen him. In the last 5 years, he's been a ghost. All strategy, all defense. He slept less in the last 2 days than he has in a month, but he smiles more. Be careful." Before June could process that, Nico hung up the phone and looked across the room, his eyes finding hers. He didn't smile, but his gaze lingered, a brief, silent acknowledgement that felt as tangible as a touch. June's heart gave a painful, awkward lurch. She looked down at her coffee, her face suddenly hot. Nico drove her back to her apartment himself. He took the long way, over the high causeway bridge that spanned the mouth of the harbor. The wind was heavy, full of salt, rocking the massive sedan. Far below, the lights of container ships moved like fallen stars on the black, churning water. He pulled the car over at the apex, killing the engine. The only sounds were the wind and the distant groan of the bridge's support cables. "I feel like a pawn," June whispered into the darkness. "My entire life, I ran from her. I changed my name. I made myself small. I hid, and I ran right into her arms. She's been playing me against you. She wanted me to find that warehouse. She wanted me to have that drive." Nico turned to her. The green glow of the dashboard lights carved his face out of the shadows. "A pawn is only a pawn if it moves for someone else." He didn't touch her, but his voice was so close it was a physical presence. "If I have to be a king in this game," he said, "I would rather be a king in check, just to let you move first. You're not her pawn. June. You're the one who just flipped the whole board over." The air in the car was suddenly too small, too charged. June's phone buzzed on the console, shattering the moment. It was a text from a restricted number. No words, just an image. It was a schematic, a small, black submersible drone, the kind used for marine research, but this one had a payload attached to compact explosive charge. A second text came through immediately, a glossy, digital invitation. "You are cordially invited to the North Water Redevelopment Gala. Location the Everdeep Aquarium, time 48 hours from now." June showed the screen to Nico. His face hardened into granite. "The aquarium," he said, his voice flat. "It's Quinn's biggest charity project, and I'm on the host committee. I'm scheduled to give a speech." He looked from the invitation to the bomb schematic. The plan snapped into focus. Cold and brutal. "They're not just going to hit the gala," June said. "No," Nico replied, starting the car. "They're going to frame me for it. the violent mafia boss sabotaging the city's future. They'll discredit me, silence me, and get their vote in one single explosive night. The ever-deep aquarium, after midnight, was a world of liquid blue and shadow. The public halls were dark, but the massive tanks cast a faint, undulating light that rippled across the concrete floors of the service corridors. The air hummed with the sound of powerful filtration pumps and smelled of ozone and clean, cold salt water. Dressed in the gray coveralls of a third-party sanitation crew, Nico and June moved silently along the staff-only catwalks that ran behind the main exhibits. On the other side of the foot-thick acrylic, impossible creatures drifted in the dark sea dragons, giant groupers, and a vast, mesmerizing bloom of jellyfish, their bodies pulsing with soft, internal light like a galaxy of living lanterns. The unearthly blue glow swam across their faces, making them strangers to each other. June carried a small, waterproof fiber-optic camera on a flexible coil. Nico carried a climbing rope and a small data skimmer. They reached the main attraction, the sunken cathedral tank, a 3-million-gallon exhibit that formed the centerpiece of the gala hall. The speaker's podium would be placed directly over it. "The anonymous text said submersible drone," June whispered, her voice lost in the hum of the pumps. "It won't come through the main filtration. It has to be an auxiliary access point, a drainage or ventilation duct." She spotted a large, grated vent near the bottom of the massive tank, 20 feet below their catwalk. It was the only opening, large enough. "I need to get the camera inside that grate," she said. Nico didn't argue. He anchored the safety rope to a steel support beam, testing the knot with his full weight. He looped the other end through a harness they had hidden under her coveralls, securing it low on her waist. June swung her legs over the railing, finding her footing on a narrow maintenance ledge. She leaned out over the black water, her reflection staring back at her from the acrylic. Nico stood directly above, paying out the line, his stance wide and solid. He was her anchor. The rope was taut in his grasp, and she could feel the steady, grounded heat of his hands through the line. A silent reassurance. His calm, even breathing was the only rhythm she focused on as she maneuvered the tiny camera into the vent. "Got it," she whispered, feeding the coil in. A sound. Heavy, rubber-soled footsteps approaching from the far end of the corridor. Not the lazy shuffle of a night watchman. These were measured. Authoritative, iron bar. Nico's hand clamped on the rope, instantly hauling June back over the railing. She landed silently on the metal grid. He grabbed her hand, pulling her back, searching the shadows. The only cover was a deep alcove beneath a steel staircase that led to the pump room. They squeezed into the narrow, triangular space, pressing themselves back against the cold, damp concrete. The footsteps grew louder, closer. 2 men, their voices low. They were just yards away. Nico pressed June fully behind him, shielding her, but the space was too small. He had to turn, flattening his body against hers, his chest to her back. The footsteps stopped. June held her breath. She could feel the solid wall of Nico's chest against her shoulder blades, his arm protectively across her. The space was utterly dark, filled with the smell of wet metal, salt, and the faint, clean scent of mint from his clothes. The air in the alcove was frigid. A draft swept up from the pump room below. June, damp with spray from the tank, began to shiver violently, the tremor racking her body. She pressed her lips together, terrified the movement would give them away. Nico felt it. He didn't hesitate. With one arm still braced against the wall, he used his free hand to shrug out of his heavy wool jacket. In the cramped darkness, he pulled her back against him and wrapped the coat around her shoulders, pulling the lapels closed. The footsteps outside moved again. A flashlight beam cut across the corridor, missing their hiding spot by inches, illuminating the wall opposite. June was trembling so hard she could barely breathe. Nico's hand, which had just secured the coat, came up. His fingers grazed a strand of damp hair plastered to her cheek by the tank's spray. He gently tucked it behind her ear. His thumb brushed her cheek, a rough, warm callus against her icy skin. The flashlight beam vanished. The footsteps receded, fading down the hall. They didn't move. In the absolute, pressurized silence. June was intensely aware of his hand, still resting on the side of her face. His warmth was a stark contrast to the cold steel at her back. He shifted, just enough to see her in the faint, rippling blue light from the tank. He watched her. His dark eyes were unreadable, but his intent was not. He didn't move. He didn't demand. He waited. It was a pause that lasted an eternity, a silent question that gave her all the power. June's answer wasn't a word. Her own hand, cold and trembling, came up from inside the jacket. She didn't push him away. She rested her fingers on his collarbone, her thumb brushing the hard line of his jaw. It was all the permission he needed. He leaned in. The kiss was slow and certain. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of two people in danger. It was a deliberate act of grounding. His lips were firm and warm, a stark contrast to the cold fear that had paralyzed her moments before. It was a promise. Her breath hitched, and she felt the shiver finally stop, replaced by a different, spreading warmth. His other hand came up, cradling her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Her back was pressed to the cold, hard wall, but his chest was a solid, warm shield. It was a kiss that spoke of finding an anchor in the middle of a storm, a quiet, profound discovery in the dark. A soft, digital beep came from her pocket. They broke apart slowly. The moment lingered, heavy and electric. June looked down, then back at him, a small, startled smile touching her lips. His expression was serious, but his eyes were softer. The work, they had a job to do. June pulled the data skimmer from her pocket. While they were hiding, it had been wirelessly copying the positioning data from a secure iron bar network router on the wall. The screen was no longer blank. It was full. They stepped out from under the stairs. The corridor was empty. The jellyfish pulsed. Everything was the same, but everything had changed. June studied the screen. "I have it," she whispered, her voice thick. "The telemetry data for the gala. They aren't just putting the drone in the tank." She pointed to the schematic on the screen. "They're installing a new decorative base for the auction podium. The drone isn't the bomb. Nico, it's the delivery system. It's programmed to attach a charge to the underside of the podium, right where you'll be standing." They heard a new sound, a door slamming open, a shout. "Sector 4, check the pump room." They had been discovered. "This way," Nico said, grabbing her hand. They ran. They burst out of a fire exit into a service alley, the alarm bells finally starting to ring inside the aquarium. 2 iron bar guards were rounding the corner, weapons raised. Before they could even aim, the roar of an engine filled the narrow alley. Rhodes Pike, at the wheel of the black sedan, slammed the car sideways, blocking the guard's path. "Go get in the other car," he bellowed, already climbing out, a heavy tire iron in his hand, creating the diversion. Nico didn't wait. He pulled June down the alley, where Blake Wren was waiting in a second. Nondescript vehicle. They piled in, and the car sped away, tires squealing on the wet pavement. As they merged into the pre-dawn traffic, Nico still held her hand. He seemed to realize it at the same time she did, his grip tightening for a fraction of a second longer than was necessary before he reluctantly let go. He looked straight ahead, out the windshield, at the gray city waking up. "Don't disappear again," he said, his voice low. June looked at his profile, the hard set of his jaw. She simply nodded, the warmth of the kiss, and the jacket still draped over her shoulders, holding the cold at bay. The air in the fish market office was thick with the coming storm. Maura Vale stood before a large whiteboard, her marker sketching a flowchart of power that looked like a spider's web. "It's not just a land grab," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the heavy silence. "It is a coup. Vera and Quinn have built a perfect machine." She tapped the center of the board, where she'd written, "Gala." "This is the linchpin. If that bomb goes off, and you are blamed, Nico, the city doesn't just panic. The city council doesn't just vote. They scramble to approve the North Water sale. They will seize your assets, all of them, as criminal collateral to fund the city's healing. Silas Quinn will be handed the entire harbor on a silver platter, hailed as a hero for stepping in to stabilize the very crisis his own team created. Mara underlined CSB and Vera twice. They get the money, the power, and the public's blessing. They win. They win everything. June was staring at the encrypted hard drive, plugged into her terminal. As Mara spoke, a new window popped up on her screen, an incoming, untraceable video call. Her stomach clenched. She hit accept. The face that appeared was not the broken victim June had mourned. Vera Hart looked flawless, poised. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. She sat in an office that was all glass and cold, white light. She smiled, but the expression didn't touch her eyes. "Daughter," Vera's voice was smooth, warm, and utterly terrifying. "You always were too clever for your own good. You're meddling in things that are far too big for you." "Like you." June's voice was a low tremor. "Exactly like me," Vera said, her smile tightening. "I'm offering you a courtesy. June, leave him. Walk away from Avalon and his petty street brawls. If you're gone by morning, I will personally remove Verdigris Market from the redevelopment schedule. I'll let the market stand." Rage, hot and acidic, burned in June's throat. "You're offering to trade a neighborhood for your own daughter." "I'm offering you a choice. Him or them." "Why?" June whispered, the question torn out of her. "Why burn your own house down just to warm your hands?" Vera leaned forward, her eyes becoming cold. "Hard stones. Because the house is rotten. June, it's full of termites. Men like Avalon, you can't rebuild a structure until you've burned away the sickness. Order needs a storm to be reborn. Bayhaven needs a firm hand. My hand." The screen went black. June stared at her own reflection, shaking. A shadow fell over her. Nico was standing in the doorway. He had heard the end of it. She didn't look up. She felt ashamed, exposed, a tool in her mother's war. He walked over to her, his footsteps silent on the concrete floor. He didn't speak. He just placed his hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of pity. It was one of solidarity, heavy, warm, and present. "We cannot choose our parents. June," he said, his voice a low rumble, "but we can choose how we walk the path together." She let out the breath she had been holding since the call began, and for 1 second, she leaned her head against his hand. He squeezed her shoulder once, then stepped back. The time for comfort was over. "She wants a storm," he said to the room. "We'll give her one, but it will be a storm of light." The counterplan was forged in the next hour. "Mara," Nico commanded. "The live stream. It's a go." "My contact is in," Mara said, her fingers flying on her laptop. "The moment the gala starts, we have a 5-minute uninterruptible window piped directly to every independent news feed in the city." June held up the small, breadboarded device she'd been building. "The trigger for the bomb is a high-frequency radio signal. This is a sniffer. The second they arm that device, this will light up. I'll know where the signal is coming from." "I'm on the perimeter," Rhodes added, cleaning his sidearm. "Iron Bar is running event security, but they're using gala staff as cover. I'll handle the exits. Make sure the rats can't leave the trap once we spring it." Nico looked at Mara. "Set up the camera." He sat down in front of it, straightening his tie. He was making the biggest gamble of his life. He recorded a statement. He confessed, not to murder, but to the gray operations, the control of the docks, the intimidation, the shell companies. He admitted to being the shadow Bayhaven whispered about, and then, looking straight into the camera, he made a pledge. He would turn over all his holdings to a public community trust for Harbor's Edge and submit to a full federal investigation in exchange for the full prosecution of Silas Quinn, Vera Hart, and the Civic Shadow Bureau. He was laying his own kingdom down as bait. Hours later, the plans were set, the recording was ready, the city outside was being lashed by a cold, violent rain, the war room was empty, the team scattered to make their final preparations. Only Nico and June remained. They found themselves, as if drawn by a magnet, back at the Gull and Anchor. The restaurant was dark, the closed for repairs sign swinging in the wind, but the kitchen was dry and warm, the pilot lights of the massive range casting a soft, blue glow. The rain hammered against the windows, a frantic, drumming rhythm. June was checking her signal sensor for the 10th time, her hands unable to stay still. Nico stood by the window, watching the streetlights glitter on the wet pavement. He turned, and she looked up. The silence in the kitchen was charged, thick with everything unsaid, with the kiss in the aquarium, with the fight to come. He walked over to her. She didn't move. He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his chest. He raised his hand, as he had done before, and gently touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing. That was all he needed. He drew her in, and his arms wrapped around her, pulling her against him in a long, crushing embrace. It was an embrace of desperation, a silent acknowledgement that they were the only two solid things in a world that was falling apart. June buried her face in the wool of his jacket, breathing in the scent of salt and mint, her hands gripping his back as if she would never let go. He held her, his chin resting on the top of her head, just letting the sound of the rain fill the space. When he finally pulled back, it was only enough to look at her. The blue light of the pilot flames danced in his dark eyes. The kiss that followed was not a gentle discovery. It was a confirmation. It was deep and long, a desperate claiming. Her hands fisted in his jacket, pulling him closer. His breath was ragged against her mouth. His jacket, the one from the aquarium, slipped from her shoulders and fell unheeded to the tiled floor. His arms banded around her waist, and he lifted her, pressing her back against the cool, stainless steel counter. Their breathing was the only sound, harsh and loud, dueling with the storm. His lips left hers, trailing fire along her jaw to the sensitive skin of her neck. Her head fell back, her fingers tangling in his hair. His hands moved from her waist, sliding up her back, his palms flat against the fabric of her shirt, pressing her impossibly closer. She could feel the hard, thudding beat of his heart against her own, a frantic rhythm that seemed to shake them both. It was a claiming, a desperate, tactile promise in the face of the morning. It was escalating, building toward a point of no return. He was the one who broke it. With a ragged groan, he pulled back, resting his forehead against hers. They were both panting, their eyes closed. The air between them was electric. A small, shaky smile touched his lips. "We need to save something for tomorrow," he whispered, his voice rough. "We still have a fight to win." June let out a shaky breath, a smile of her own answering him. "To fight," she agreed, her voice barely audible. The tension snapped, replaced by a quiet, exhausted intimacy. He found a tray of apple tarts the baker had left. He warmed them in the oven. They sat on the floor, their backs against the cabinets, the windows rattling from the wind. They ate the warm tarts with their fingers. The silence comfortable, safe. June leaned her head on his shoulder, and his arm came around her, pulling her close. "Nico," she whispered, watching the rain. "If something goes wrong tomorrow, if they win, don't let me be evidence. Don't let them use me." He was silent for a moment. He turned his head, his lips brushing her hair. "You are not evidence, June," he replied, his voice firm. "You are the reason." They stayed like that, dozing in the warmth of the kitchen, until the first gray light of dawn began to creep in. June was jolted awake by a faint, electronic chime. Mara's secure laptop, which she had left on a counter, was flashing. The screen clock read 2:03 a.m. A new alert had just come through the secured channel monitoring Iron Bar's internal comms. June was on her feet in an instant, her blood turning to ice. Nico. He was awake before his name was fully spoken. What? She pointed to the screen. They just changed the security shift for the gala, the morning team, the one supposed to set up. It's not the regular event staff. They've been swapped out. For who? June looked at him, her eyes wide with dawning horror. Iron Bar's tactical unit. They're moving. The timeline. It's not tomorrow. It's now. The Everdeep Aquarium was a symphony of blue light and black tuxedos. Jazz music, smooth and cool, drifted through the humid air, mixing with the polite murmur of Bay Haven's elite. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with trays of champagne. Above them, behind the 3-story-high acrylic, sharks and silver-scaled tarpon glided through the deep. Silent blue. At the center of the grand hall, on a stage built over the main tank, Silas Quinn was glowing. He spoke of community, renewal, and a brighter future for our shared harbor. He was grace and optimism, the city's favorite son. When he finished, to a wave of enthusiastic applause, the MC, a local news anchor in a glittering gown, stepped to the microphone. And now, a man who has pledged his own significant resources to this revitalization, Mr. Nico Avalon. Nico buttoned his black suit jacket. The recorded confession felt like a block of lead in his inside pocket. He nodded to the polite applause and began to walk toward the stage. In a cramped, hot control booth above the gala, June Hart was blind to the glamour. She wore a technician's uniform, her hair stuffed under a baseball cap. A set of modified headphones covered her ears, amplifying a single, faint, low-frequency pulse. Her sniffer. She watched a waiter, one of Iron Bar's men, moving through the crowd. The signal was coming from a transmitter hidden in his service tray. He was the relay. Miles away, in the back of a secure van, Mara Vale hit a switch. "We are live," she whispered. The hidden cameras June had planted, plus Nico's own recording, were now feeding directly to the independent press. The trap was set. Near the kitchens, Rhodes, wearing an ill-fitting event staff blazer, checked the fire exits. He found the main one, as he expected, wedged shut from the outside with a block of hard rubber. He pulled a pry bar from under his jacket, worked the wedge free, and tossed it into a planter. The door was now clear. He leaned against the wall, just another bored guard. Back in the booth, June's brow furrowed. The signal was moving, but it was just a carrier wave. The trigger wasn't on the waiter. He was just the antenna. She scanned the room, her sniffer's directional sensor panning. The source. It was strong. It was coming from the stage itself. Her eyes snapped to the MC. The woman was wearing a heavy, ostentatious pearl necklace. As she smiled at Nico, she bent forward slightly. The stage lights glinted off something metallic woven between the pearls. It was a secondary stage receiver. The drone wasn't the bomb. The necklace was the bomb. The drone was just the excuse, the decoy. "No," June whispered. "The signal." Her sensors panned up, away from the stage, to the VIP balcony overlooking the hall. A man in a tuxedo, the Iron Bar coordinator from the aquarium, was standing there. His hand in his pocket, the frequency spiked. He was arming it. He was going to kill the MC and Nico and frame him for that. June was out of the booth. Sprinting down the service stairs, she burst onto the VIP level, shoving past a startled councilman. The coordinator saw her. His eyes widened, his hand coming out of his pocket, holding a small black transmitter. She didn't give him time. She grabbed a spindly, decorative folding chair and used it as a lever, shoving the legs hard into his stomach, pinning him to the velvet-roped wall. He gasped, his arm raising. She brought the heel of her hand down, a sharp, precise strike on his ulnar nerve, the same move from the restaurant. His fingers went numb. The transmitter fell. June snatched it out of the air. The small screen was illuminated, a red digital timer counting down. 9 seconds. 8. A voice, her mother's voice, suddenly filled her earpiece, hijacking the frequency. It was cold, calm, and perfectly clear. "Put it down, June." June froze, the transmitter clutched in her hand. 7 seconds. "I'll trade you," Vera's voice said. "Let it happen. Let him die, and I will spare the market. I'll take Verdigris off the list. It's his life for theirs. Your choice, daughter." 6 seconds. June's head snapped up across the vast blue-lit expanse of the gala on the opposite balcony. She saw her, Vera Hart. She was standing in the shadows, wearing a severe slate-gray dress, a phone to her ear. She was watching. On the stage, Nico had just reached the podium. He saw the struggle on the balcony. He saw June, frozen, her face a mask of horror, a guard fighting her. The plan was dead. He had to improvise. He stepped to the microphone, but he didn't look at his prepared notes. He smiled, a wide, confident smile that reached every camera in the room. "Thank you," he said. "Mister, Quinn speaks of a transparent future." He turned to Silas, who was still preening by his chair. "In that spirit, I have a surprise. I invite Mr. Silas Quinn to join me up here, right now, to publicly sign a binding pledge of total financial transparency for the Northwater Trust." Silas froze. The applause was thunderous. He was trapped, sweating, his smile plastic. He had no choice but to begin walking toward the stage. 3 seconds. June's eyes locked with her mother's across the hall. Vera was smiling. June made her choice. Her thumb found the release clip for the transmitter's battery cover. With the strength of pure adrenaline, she snapped the plastic, ripped the battery out, and crushed the exposed microchip under her heel. The timer died. She looked up at her mother. Vera's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold fury. June raised her hand. It wasn't a weapon. It was the small, pen-sized laser pointer from her tech kit. She clicked it on, and a single, precise dot of red light appeared on Vera Hart's chest. It wasn't a threat. It was a message. "I see you. I know everything, and you've lost." A sudden, sharp ping sounded in her earpiece. A new alert. She glanced at the sensor on her wrist. It was flashing. New device detected. It wasn't a decoy. It was coming from the pump room, from below the tank. A second, heavily shielded submersible drone. It was already at the foundation. And it was armed. The sensor on June's wrist was screaming, a flashing red timer that had appeared from nowhere. 20 seconds. 19. This was not a decoy. This was the failsafe. Down below, the gala was a sea of confusion. Nico was on the stage. Silas Quinn frozen halfway to him, the crowd sensing the shift, the tension, the raw, unfiltered panic from the VIP balcony. June didn't shout a warning. There was no time. She moved. She sprinted along the balcony and vaulted over the waist-high glass partition. She fell 10 feet, landing in a crouch on the narrow, vibrating metal catwalk that hung suspended directly over the 3-million-gallon sunken cathedral tank. The water below was a deep, swirling, illuminated blue. The crowd saw her. A collective gasp, then a wave of screams. The room shattered into chaos. "Code Red," Rhodes Pike's voice bellowed from the service corridor. He hit the fire alarm panel, but not the real one. He triggered a pre-recorded evacuation message, his own voice directing the flow. "Evacuate calmly through the main atrium. This is a drill." He was at the fire exit he had cleared, pushing the panicked elite out, creating a controlled stampede, clearing the kill zone. From her remote van, Maura Vale's voice was ice. She kept the live stream running, her camera feed switching to the diagram of the money trail. "We are receiving live reports," she narrated, her voice overriding the jazz music, "of an explosive device planted within the aquarium. Sources confirm the hardware is registered to Iron Bar Shielding and the Office of Urban Integrity." The words went out. The accusation was public. Across the hall, Vera Hart saw her daughter on the catwalk. She saw her plan, years of work unraveling in seconds, her face, a mask of cold fury, turned from June to Nico. She pulled a second, identical transmitter from her evening bag, a backup. If June stopped the drone, she would personally detonate the charge under Nico's feet, a punctuation mark. Silas Quinn saw his opening. The crowd was a river of screaming, fleeing bodies. He bolted for the exit, but he ran directly into a wall of uniformed civilian security, who grabbed his arms. He was trapped. His face, slick with sweat and pale with terror, caught in the beam of a spotlight, broadcast live to the entire city. June was on her comms, the tiny earpiece crackling. Nico. "June, get out of there!" His voice was ragged, desperate, coming from the stage. "The drone! It's under the tank!" she yelled, crawling along the narrow beam. "It's the Foundation!" He saw her, a small, dark figure suspended over the abyss. He knew she wouldn't make it back. He stepped away from the podium, his voice dropping, for her alone. "June," he said, his voice thick with a terrible finality, "if you don't get clear, remember that I—" "No," she cut him off, her voice fierce, a command. "Don't you dare say goodbye. You look at me. Kiss me with your eyes, Nico, right now." She looked up, her gaze locking with his across the chaotic, blue-lit expanse, his eyes dark and filled with a desperate, raw love burned into hers. It was a promise, a vow, a lifetime, all exchanged in one, silent, shattering second. 8 seconds. June dropped from the catwalk, landing hard on the lower maintenance platform, her boots splashing into an inch of frigid, overflowing tank water. She saw the drone, a black, menacing shape, magnetically clamped to the main structural support. She was too late to disarm it. She ripped the magnetic utility hook from her belt. She didn't try to pull the drone off. She hooked the secondary service hatch next to it and yanked it open. With 4 seconds left, she plunged her hand into her pocket and pulled out the paperclip she had used on the warehouse lock. She shoved the metal clip deep into the drone's exposed detonator wiring. A violent shower of white sparks erupted. The water around her feet boiled and hissed. The drone's internal mechanisms fused, the signal dead, the charge inert. Across the room, Vera Hart saw the sparks. She screamed, a sound of pure, primal rage, and jammed her thumb down on the backup transmitter, the one aimed at Nico's podium. At the exact same instant, June, anticipating the move, threw the only thing she had, her digital stopwatch. It spun end over end, a silver discus. The glass face caught the glare of 3 different stage lights, flashing a brilliant, blinding strobe of white light directly into Vera's eyes. Vera flinched, a human reflex. Her thumb hit the button a millisecond late. In that same split second, Nico, seeing the motion, understanding the podium was the target, grabbed the heavy, solid wood lectern. With a roar, he heaved it, shoving it sideways. The lectern toppled, blocking the direct line of sight path between Vera's transmitter and the receiver beneath the stage. Nothing happened. The signal failed. Silence. Silas Quinn, seeing the bomb fail, tried to bolt one last time. Rhodes Pike was on him in 2 strides, tackling him to the polished floor with the force of a freight train. Mara seized the moment. The spider's web chart, the one connecting Northwater, Quinn Iron Bar, and the CSB flashed onto the aquarium's massive, 20-foot-tall projection screen, replacing the image of tranquil jellyfish. The remaining crowd, the guards, the staff, all stopped. They stared at the undeniable proof. The room was a cacophony of shouts and accusations. Vera Hart turned. Her face was a blank mask. She moved, not running, but walking swiftly, toward a dark maintenance door. She reached for the handle, but a hand was already on it. June Hart stood there, soaking wet, her chest heaving, the dead paperclip still clutched in her fist. "Mom," June said, her voice shaking but unbroken. Vera stopped. The 2 women stared at each other. The shifting, watery blue light of the tank played over their faces. "You chose the storm," June said, her voice raw. "I'm choosing the bridge." Nico's footsteps echoed on the marble. He came to a stop, not in front of June, not shielding her, but standing just behind her, his shoulder aligned with hers. A silent, unmovable wall. "We are together," he said. Vera Hart looked at her daughter. She looked at the man standing with her, She saw the new world order she had tried to build, her vision of a city reborn in fire, collapse into ash. Slowly, her fingers uncurled, the black transmitter fell from her hand, clattering uselessly on the floor. The silence in the hall was as deep and heavy as the water in the tank. The blast wave of the gala was legal, not physical. The CSB's lawyers arrived like a cleanup crew, but Mara's live stream had already gone viral. It was the talk of every news station, played and replayed on every phone in the city. The Metropolitan Crime Directorate, trapped by the overwhelming weight of public opinion, had no choice but to act. Silas Quinn, his face a mask of sweaty, indignant terror, was photographed in handcuffs. Iron Bar Shielding had its city contracts suspended by an emergency injunction within 12 hours. The Northwater Redevelopment Trust, its name now synonymous with civic corruption, frantically announced it was indefinitely postponing the harbor vote. In a gray, windowless room at the MCD precinct, June sat opposite her mother. Vera Hart was not crying. She was not begging. She sat with the same cold, perfect posture she'd had on the balcony. "I thought I was saving the city," Vera said, her voice quiet, conversational. "It's a dying organism. June, choked by petty criminals like Avalon, strangled by bureaucracy. I was performing surgery, a controlled burn to allow new growth." June stared at the woman who had built a throne of lies. "You don't save people by burning them out of their homes. Mom, you don't perform surgery with a thermite charge. No one needs to be saved by fire." Vera simply looked at her, a strange analytical curiosity in her eyes. "You chose the bridge. Bridges are built to be walked on. Daughter, remember that." Nico Avalon, however, embraced the spotlight. The following morning, on the steps of the now famous fish market, he faced a wall of microphones. He did not deflect. He announced, his voice clear and carrying in the cold morning air, that he was immediately transferring the entirety of his port-side holdings, every pier and every shipping manifest, into a newly formed community trust for Harbor's Edge. Furthermore, he was voluntarily submitting himself and his companies to a full public financial investigation. He laid his entire kingdom at the city's feet. June did not return to the kitchen. She went to Verdigris Market, where Nico's community kitchen was now a bustling hub of activity and organization. She stood on the flatbed of a truck and spoke to the residents. She promised to help them build their own security network. In the back room of a bakery, she started classes, teaching people how to spot surveillance, how to secure their own homes, and, in a skill that brought murmurs of approval, how to read lips. She folded her waitress apron, the one stained with grease and fear, and placed it in a box. The next time Nico saw her, she was wearing a simple, dark training jacket, her hair pulled back, her eyes sharp as she pointed out blind spots on a map. Weeks later, the city was still breathing, slowly. The investigations were grinding on. One night, they found themselves on the High Causeway Bridge, the wind howling, the air sharp with salt. They got out of the car. The wind whipped June's hair across her face as she looked down at the harbor lights. He moved to stand behind her, a shield against the wind. She leaned back against his chest. He didn't speak for a long time. Then, his arms came around her, his hands finding hers, lacing their fingers together. "I'm here," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear, solid as the steel bridge beneath their feet. "I'm not turning my back again." She turned in his embrace, her cold fingers gripping his. He looked down at her, and the kiss they shared was cold and sharp with the taste of the sea, a raw, real promise against the night. It was not a kiss of frantic discovery, but of quiet, settled fact. Their hands stayed tightly clasped between them, a knot of shared warmth against the cold. Vera Hart's temporary hearing was a quiet affair. As she was led out, her eyes scanned the gallery and found June. She paused. For a fraction of a second, the mask of cold iron cracked. She gave a single, sharp nod. It was not an apology. It was an acknowledgement. The board had been flipped, and the game had been well played. In the fish market office, Mara raised a styrofoam cup. "To Rhodes," she said, toasting the large man who, as always, was leaning against the doorframe. "Bayhaven's #1 doorkeeper." Rhodes grunted, which was as close as he ever came to a smile. All across Verdigris Market, small, defiant, hand-painted signs were appearing in windows. "We are staying." That night, on the pier, the air was still. June leaned her head on Nico's shoulder, watching the lights twinkle on the water. The harbor looked peaceful. "The Harbor's Edge Trust is forming a board," Nico said quietly. "They need a director of community safety. What title do you want?" "June." She smiled, a real, tired smile. She looked up at him. "I don't need a title," she whispered. "I just want the responsibility." He laughed, a low, warm sound that felt like the first truly safe moment in her life. They walked back toward the city, stopping at the Gull and Anchor, which was finally reopening. Tucked in the handle of the freshly painted door was a plain, brown manila envelope, no name. June's smile faded. She pulled it free. Inside was not a letter, but a single, black plastic card, a CSB Systems access key, level high. Tucked behind it was a small note, folded once. The handwriting was precise, familiar and cold. "There is one more pier underground, V." June felt the air go cold again. She looked up at Nico, the streetlights reflecting in her wide eyes. Her fingers found his, and she squeezed, hard. "Shall we turn around one more time, Nico?" He looked from the dark, coded promise of the card to the fire in her eyes. A slow, dangerous smile. The one she had first seen in the restaurant, spread across his face. "This time," he said, "they won't be the ones laughing last. We will." Thank you for listening to this story. Please comment below and let us know where you are listening from to connect. Subscribe to Mafia Boss Stories, like the video, and support us by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by more people.